Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I am talking today with, I will say, Dr. Nick Gier, but you said just call you Nick. So welcome, Nick, to Mind Shift Podcast.
Yes. Was that a question?
It could be a question. Just say thank you now. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes. Okay.
So, yes, we have a lot.
Thanks for having.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I should have done it. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, I'm so glad to chat with you because I've got so many questions. When we contacted each other, I think I got your email, would have been formerly through the University of Idaho, but we were able to chat back and forth. And you made a comment. You said something like, we're talking about Doug Wilson, and he is your most famous student. So, of course, you were the professor of Doug Wilson back in, I guess it would have been the late 1970s. Is that correct?
Yes. Early 80s. I'm not exactly. I think it was early 80s when he was in my ethics class.
Mm-hmm. So he took your at the University of Idaho. What were you teaching at the time? You were teaching philosophy and some other subjects?
That's right. And he was a philosophy major. And he took, I think, nearly every course that I taught.
Yeah, is that a good problem to have, or what?
No, it was a good interaction. We were respectful for each other. And after that first class, I believe it was ethics class in the 1980s, he came up to me and said, Professor Gier, I hope you don't mind if I defend the faith. And I made the fatal sort of affirmation, go ahead, Doug.
Do your worst.
Yeah, right. So we had lots of debates. They were respectful. Outside of class, we became friends. I became friends with his father as well, Jim Wilson, and that friendship continued. I think I had lunch with him, probably 7 or 8 years ago. And the main point of our discussion was his disappointment with his son about how he had joined a Calvinist movement. And that, of course, for free will evangelicals, that is not the denomination follow. I asked him also if he would still defend his little booklet about using military techniques to spread the faith. And I asked him directly, don't you think that cover with Jesus holding a big sword is a little too provocative?
Correct, a little off-putting.
And he said, oh no, I mean that. That's what we're about. So that was my last contact with Jim Wilson. And sadly, he died of cancer this past year. And Doug was by his side for weeks. He moved his entire, computer and, what he needed to continue his work to be with his father. I thought that was a really nice thing to learn about Doug.
One of the few nice things we could say about it. Well, now, for those that are a little bit confused, okay, going back, as I understand the storyline, Jim, his father, was in the U.S. Navy, and he resigned his commission to move, I believe it was to Pullman, Washington, to open a Christian bookstore. Is that what brought essentially Doug Wilson to the area? Because he wasn't born and raised in that Moscow Pullman area, was he?
No, and I don't know where he was born, but Doug was, and his brother Ian were probably in their, I don't know exactly, but he moved to Moscow, not Pullman, and he set up 3 bookstores on the way. Jim Wilson was very concerned about the Mormon heretics, and he thought that he had to really show them the truth of Christianity. So he set up a bookstore in Brigham Young, as in boy,
Yeah.
I have to.
It's in Salt Lake City, isn't it? Yeah, somewhere.
Yes, yeah. And Provo. He set up a.
Oh, right. Right in the Mormon heartland, then, basically.
Yeah. Going
straight in.
No, these people are, they're
serious.
They're serious and no holds barred.
Yep.
So as the years progressed, he closed the one in Provo first. The one in Pullman, called One Way, also was closed, and he was left with his bookstore in Moscow. And he bought the theater next to, the movie theater next to his bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where he was until he, died of cancer. Very, very active. His Facebook was loaded with little mini sermons and that sort of thing. Very active until his death.
Because I understand it, Jim Wilson then, aside from that book you mentioned, or a little booklet about looking at towns like Moscow and Pullman as strategic, strongholds for evangelism, because both have major universities. You've got Washington State University in Pullman and the University of Idaho in Moscow. He's looking at those areas, say this is absolutely perfect for a strategic takeover to Christianize these two towns. And from what I understand, Doug Wilson has basically taken that model on board, and that's a lot of the driving force behind this, basically like a sprawling religious empire he's created over the last however many decades. Would you say that's a fair assessment of what happened?
Yes, exactly. Pullman is no longer a target. It's Moscow, Idaho, and they're very serious about that. At one time, he had a Texas donor who had about $3 million, and some of that money was, put into Christ Church, and a lot of students are recruited for Logos School and for New St. Andrews. So those people have moved to town, and the graduates of New St. Andrews have set up businesses, some of them, in Moscow. And then there's a huge corporation. It's mainly dealing with labor statistics, as I can understand it. It's called EMCI. And the CEO of that company is a member of Christ Church.
Right. It's Andrew Krapachetz, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right. And
I heard they hired a lot of NSAC graduates to work at this place as well.
Exactly.
Right.
He told the community in an interview in the paper that he has lots of non-church members, and I guess we just have to take his word for that.
Right.
But I've learned that many of them have quit because there are Bible studies groups that some of these people feel very uncomfortable about.
All right. So it's part of the work day sort of thing, like, oh, we're going to have these Bible studies at work and, pressure people to join and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I heard was happening. He's bought lots of properties. He has bought 3 huge grain elevators. And during Christmas time, he lights up the elevators with Merry Christmas. And so he's a big as a mover and shaker in the town. And people are very concerned.
Yes, that's the key, isn't it? There's a lot of pushback, because I watched the documentary My Town. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's very fascinating. And I'm sure we'll get into this around, I think it was 2004, there was a conference, in air quotes, about his book, Southern Slavery as It Was. And that documentary was filmed around that time. And there was a lot of pushback by the locals saying, we're not happy about what Doug Wilson and his church are doing to Moscow. We don't want him to be the face of this town. And there's a lot of negative reactions, which makes me wonder, is his message actually finding an audience, as it were? Because I've heard that a lot of people that are filling the pews, as it were, at Christ Church, they've actually moved to Moscow from outside that area. They weren't born and raised there, as it were. They're not local converts. He's recruiting people, in other words, from outside. Do you think that's how it's going?
Well, I think maybe we need to sort of correct that a little bit. That is, the people coming from the outside are students for New St. Andrews,
right,
and for Logos School. And it's important to also correct the impression that Doug Wilson controls the K-12 Logos school. A long time ago, there was some concern about Doug Wilson controlling that school because there were other evangelical churches in town that were sending their students to that. So I think he's still on the board, but his power there is really reduced because the free evangelicals, if I can use that term, in the area don't want the Calvinist influence of Doug Wilson in the curriculum. So he does not control the school.
Right.
But, and I don't know for sure, I think some of these students go to New St. Andrews. So my picture of Christ Church and the congregation is that it is mainly local area people that are in the church. And the other picture that I have of that congregation, one of my downstairs tenants is a member of Christ Church. I was down there looking at her sump pump. I have to do that on occasion. And I saw a Christ Church material there. Now, she is a totally innocent, lovely lady. Right. And I'm assuming that many, and they don't really know much about the controversy of their pastor. They claim, some of them, I've talked to them, they don't know anything about it. I mentioned the slavery booklet. He said, we don't know anything about that.
Never heard of it.
Yeah. And he's a charismatic preacher. And a lot of people say, oh, don't use that word for him. Okay, but that's what he is.
Right. He's a good communicator, in other words.
He's a good communicator. And if you read his blogs, I don't read them anymore because it raises my blood pressure.
You don't need that, huh?
He's very, very clever.
Yes.
And I'm not sure, clever by half, I'm not sure if his congregants read his blog, right? They just go to church because people have told him that he's a really good pastor, and that's pretty much it.
Right. So they don't know the extent of it.
Yes, and I'm not sure if they really understand the Calvinism behind what he's doing. For example, child baptism. Free evangelicals do not baptize their children. They wait until, as the standard is for Baptists and many other Christian sects, you baptize the child when they have free will enough to know what they're doing.
The age of accountability sort of thing.
Exactly, like going through a catechism and that sort of thing. And I don't really want to make a lot of assumptions here, but I think Doug Wilson's affirmation of child baptism is a way of controlling a congregation, right? From childhood on into adult.
Literally from infancy right the way through. Yeah. If he can get them into Logos School, then New St. Andrews, then Greyfriars Hall, and then they're going out from there and planting churches with a Wilsonian, sort of theological bent or whatever, then he's achieving his ends.
Exactly. Now, that is just speculation on my part, but that's what I think his reason is and his attraction to Calvinism with child baptism. I was baptized in the Catholic Church, but my mother won the war about going to public schools and going to the Methodist Church. So it really hasn't meant much. But in Christ Church, that baptism, I think the parents are really serious about it. And what you would expect is that baptized children would continue in that faith. So that's the reason.
Yeah. I was going to say that's associated with this federal vision theology, because I don't know how much you've delved into that, but that's an aspect of the Doug Wilson controversies. I think it was back around 2002. He attended the Auburn Avenue Conference in Louisiana, and he presented some papers there, and that became known as Auburn Avenue theology, and that's that federal vision theology, one aspect of which is infant baptism. There's a bunch of other controversies associated with it, because I think the Presbyterian Church of USA, they turned around and said that's heretical. So they've actually condemned Doug Wilson on theological, biblical grounds, and said the stuff he's teaching, along with these other federal vision theologians, they considered heresy. So I mean, that's another issue that I'm sure we could delve into.
Yes,
it's another controversy, though.
Yes, and I got tired of reading that material. But there was a denominational Presbyterian Church of America, I think it was in June, and I forgot the year. There was a vote on the federal vision. And one of my informants in Christchurch was there. And the vote was about 500 and odd votes to 50 votes. It was defeated quite dramatically.
So meaning they voted it down? They said, we don't believe in the federal vision?
That's right. And Doug was trying to get some sort of association with the Presbyterian Church of America. And that failed, and he set up his own accrediting agency to go his own way.
Right. So he's got the CREC. Yeah. And that's some have said that what that does for Doug Wilson is it provides a veneer of accountability and denominational respectability. But we've seen over the past, he's very good at maneuvering, politicking, to get his way. And so he's got his own denomination now that he helped to create. So that seems to be my impression of it anyway. It's like a veneer of accountability. Is that how you would see the CREC?
Yes, exactly. And the president of New St. Andrews at the time, a former faculty member, his name will come to me, but it's not.
Dr. Roy Atwood, isn't it?
Yes, I think he's still in town, but he's just sort of low radar at this time. We used to debate, and he was even more. Doug Wilson has always been sort of civil, but Doug Atwood was really. I mean, he really. We were at several meetings, and he just really dug right in against me in a very uncivil way. Very defensive. But Roy Atwood tried to get an accreditation for New St. Andrews with the major accrediting agencies, where evangelical schools, they get accredited because they have faculty with PhDs. They have faculty that go to conferences, my Northwest Conference, great scholars there making their way, defending conservative sort of positions, but with intellectual honesty, and they get published.
Yeah, they're presenting papers and being published in journals and that kind of thing.
Exactly. And some of the schools and some of the students complain about the so-called liberal faculty members, but the board of regents of these schools realize that they have to, for accrediting purposes, keep those faculty on. It's a very interesting dynamic. So he failed, Roy Atwood failed to get accreditation with these standard agencies. So Doug Wilson set up their own accrediting agency.
and there's a pattern error. So you got I can't remember what it is, the ACCS, but it's this is accrediting agency that then accredits his classical schools models and all that, isn't it?
Exactly. And Roy Atwood was traveling the country talking about Trinitarian accreditation. And we've had debates about their position on the Trinity. That's been really fun to do. And I think they lose the debate, but I had fun doing that.
Yeah, you've tangled with them a few times.
Yes. Now, I have to sort of caution my remarks. Now, maybe New St. Andrews now has more PhDs on their faculty. In the past, I have invited those faculty to come to our regional conference and present. And Roy Atwood was just up in arms. I can't send my faculty to a conference where Nick Gier is. I was president for 1 year. But I mean, that's just cutting your nose off to spite your face, right?
Exactly.
Send your faculty. See if they can defend their points of view. But in that year, in the year following, I continued to invite them. They did not show up.
Shockingly so, they didn't show up. Yeah, they didn't want to be on the hot seat or something like that. Well, I came across your work in association. When I first started researching Doug Wilson, I think you mentioned you listened to that episode I did with Mark Potok a few years ago. And then I started getting into his book that he co-wrote with Stephen Wilkins called Southern Slavery as It Was, which I believe came out in 1996. And then there was that conference, the infamous conference in 2004, which maybe really brought the whole thing into focus. It was a firestorm of controversy and everything else. You've written a lot about Southern slavery as it was. What can you tell us about the book from your point of view?
Well, there are two events that really shocked me because I thought Doug Wilson would continue in a free evangelical sort of line. That's what his congregation in the body shop, he was always proud that a local body shop gave him the shop itself as his church.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So first, I was really shocked to learn that he'd become a Calvinist. Okay. And that he had joined the Steve Wilkins and became associated with a neo-Confederate organization. And then we learned, it was sort of under the radar for a while. I think you're right about the date of publication of that work, but we didn't learn about it until 2003. And then I read it, and my moles in Christ Church led me to the fact that 20% of it had been plagiarized. Even the subtitles of the book, that was
right. Didn't even bother to change a few words around.
That's right. Steve Wilkins admitted that he had two parishioners who were full-time researchers, and they would collect all this material, and then Steve Wilson would just sort of cut and paste.
Right.
Not only in this book, but several other books.
Yes. This is a recurring theme with Doug Wilson, plagiarism.
Yes, right. And so I did an interview in the paper, and there was a real expose about that. And I have to credit Doug Wilson for owning the mistakes in the book. He could have said he could have taken a Trump-like thing. It was all Wilkins. It's not my fault. So I have to credit Doug Wilson for saying, I'm co-author of the book. I'm responsible for everything in it. And I'm really disappointed in my good friend, Steve Wilkins, for, making that mistake. So the book was withdrawn. But the fact is that there are hundreds, if not 1,000 or two, copies of that book all over the nation, and maybe in Africa where they have one of these schools, or Europe, maybe they have some schools there. I'm sure their library still has this infamous book that is still being taught.
Yeah, and that is a part of the curriculum for homeschooling, because I talked to someone, she was raised in a Doug Wilson classical schools model of Christian homeschooling, and she said that, Southern slavery as it was one of our textbooks.
Yeah.
They grew up, and then what he did was he sort of rejigged it. I think he teamed up with a quote-unquote actual historian and then released it as it's called Black and Tan now, isn't it? It's an expanded version, but he really hasn't changed the core argument of the original book. So even then, it hasn't been fully retracted, you could say. It was just revamped as Black and Tan. So the core racist argument and everything is still there.
Yeah, it's much more subtle. Now, as far as I know, he did not team up with a reputable historian. It's all
called Genovese, I guess.
Well,
he's listed on the book as some sort of contributor or editor-ish sort of thing.
It's on the back as a blurb.
Right. Some legitimacy, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's amazing. And he was invited to New St. Andrews for not a keynote, but a graduation speaker. So, and Roy Atwood was really pleased that he was able to do that. So I don't know what the connection there is. But I knew, and I don't think he was part of the writing of the book. I don't think he was an advisor. And the real historian, oh boy, my memory is slipping here. And as soon as I have it on the tip of my tongue, it's gone. But he's an expert on antebellum slavery or the South. And his name will come to me. I can get it to you, but maybe that's not relevant. But he was a member of one of the churches, they're called...
Oh, the CREC?
Yeah.
So he was in that denomination.
That's right. And he was really outraged by the book and was part of the movement to get it published. And here's my take on Black and Tan, that here was an expert on this history, essentially telling Doug Wilson that it was not legitimate. It was intellectually honest. And Doug refused to take his advice. That is how I remember that.
Right.
So there was no co-author in that and no reputable historian that vetted that follow-up.
Yeah, Black and Tan. But what was the issue with Southern slavery as it was? Because I read the booklet a while ago when I was doing all the research on it, and I found out that, okay, on the face of it, yes, it seems to be a quote-unquote Christian or biblical defense of, like you say, antebellum South slavery. But there's another subtext that runs through the book that I picked up on, and that is, it's really, it seems to me, a defense of a fundamentalist reading, a literalistic reading of the Bible, because they take issue with the fact that they say, look, if the Bible condones slavery, which it does, then if you allow for that, then any crack could be, it appear in the facade. You can't allow for that. So you can take the Bible and use it as a battering ram against Christians. So they're, in a way, they're like, well, we're forced to defend slavery because the Bible condones it. So homosexuality, feminism, abortion, all these other things get lumped into that same sort of worldview. So there's another subtext, I think, beyond just a biblical defense of slavery. Would you see it that way as well?
Yes, that is a very good point that you're making there. And those Christians who defend inerrancy,
right,
that everything in the Bible is either factual or legitimate teaching, okay, you sort of end up in an incredible contortion of one's emotions, one's world outlet. It leads into intellectual dishonesty, right? If you are forced to defend everything in the Bible, and that's Doug's view, along with thousands of other preachers in the United States, you find yourself in part of the federal vision is, and this has been removed from the website. There used to be a journal called Credenda Agenda, which, my Trinity debate is in that journal.
Oh, right.
But there was an infamous article by a law student, and his job was to talk about how judges would rule in the new Christian nation. It's just listed everything in the Old Testament, like if a woman touches a man's genitals, she shall be punished. I forgot what the punishment was. And of course, a standard one is that disobedient children will be stoned in the town square. Now, I think they have to make some sort of, accommodation there.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's punishment for disobedient children, right? That's biblical. And disobedient members of the church. The famous excommunication of a local businessman, one of the favorite hangouts for New St. Andrews and Christian students is a bar in town, and the owner of that bar was excommunicated because he lost control of his daughter. Now, this daughter was abused by a Greyfriars student.
Right.
But here is the twist. I mean, this is what Islam does too. They blame the woman and in turn blame the father for the sin, as it were. If the daughter had been properly, cared for, this abusive fellow would not happen. Yeah. And she now is speaking out against Christ Church.
Yeah, I think I know who you're speaking of. And then I remember, if it's the case, I'm thinking of Doug Wilson. Basically, there was a lot of letters and things he wrote that said, blog posts, where he was blaming the parents. How foolish were you to allow this to happen? And she wasn't properly submissive and all the rest of it. When we come back from the break with this conversation with Dr. Nick Gier, we're going to get into this issue of Doug Wilson and Christian Reconstructionism. We're going to go on and continue to get more insights into the strange world of Doug Wilson from a guy who in some ways maybe knows him better than most people, because Dr. Nick Gier has known, obviously, Doug Wilson for decades, being a teacher, I think, going back as far as 1977 or the early 1980s at the University of Idaho, and then debating him over the years, writing articles and things about Doug Wilson. So he's got a very unique perspective. And of course, he lives right there in the Moscow, Idaho area. So he's a local as well. So he knows what's going on in the town and what's going on in Doug Wilson's ever-growing, ever-expanding religious sprawling empire. Now, speaking of Doug Wilson, we are continuing to do our last deep dive into the man. We've got but one more episode coming out. This one is just an exhausting amount of research that I've been doing on this. This is all about Doug Wilson, his views on biblical patriarchy or complementarianism, and then how that message is spreading in what's called the manosphere. This is something that David Johnson and I talked about just the other day in our follow-up episode to our so-called Christian defense of slavery. We got into that just a little bit, but really what's happening now is a very disturbing trend, because what you're seeing are people who are in Doug Wilson's orbit, people who have been influenced by him in some way, shape, or form in that biblical patriarchy, the complementarian camp in terms of evangelical theology. What they're doing is they're taking that message into the manosphere, and I'm going to do a very deep, exhaustive dive into not only what Doug Wilson's views are when it comes to biblical patriarchy and complementarianism, and there's a slight bit of difference between those two in terms of emphasis and degrees. So we got to do some unpacking there. We got to get into that. Then I'm going to talk about the manosphere, and I'm going to focus on, I think, two key individuals that are taking that biblical patriarchy complementarian view into the secular manosphere, and that's a really disturbing trend. So we're going to go into that, and I think that's going to wrap up our series on Doug Wilson. It's been a huge, long, exhausting thing, and looking at Doug Wilson and all these various aspects and avenues, and there's still more that we could do. And I've mentioned this before. I've heard from a couple of you. I have enough material to do a complete standalone episode just on his 1996 book that he co-wrote with Stephen Wilkins, Southern Slavery as It Was, and get into the theological war thesis and how that spread into homeschooling curriculum. There's a whole bunch of disturbing stuff that's going on there. So if you want me to do that episode, I might come back to that later. Let's take a break from Doug Wilson for a little bit. You can always follow me. You can find me on Twitter at Mindshift2018. You can send me a DM. You can also send me an email through the public Mindshift Podcast Facebook page. So there's a couple of ways you can get a hold of me on social media. You can always, of course, be a supporter of the show on Patreon. That helps kind of defray some of my costs, helps, kind of pay me for the time that I spent all these hours and hours researching and editing and doing all the work to keep this podcast going. And that is something you can do. The links to that, as always, are in the show notes. And that gives you access not only to our closed private Mindshift Podcast Facebook group, but of course, we also do our monthly Mindshift Zoom calls. We had one last month with David Johnson, which is available on Patreon. And then we're going to have Sam Terode. And I just had a chat with Sam the other day. An absolutely fascinating guy. He used to write a lot of books about sort of the anti-conception movement, the not really quiverful, but he got picked up by a lot of guys within that community. He did stuff for Focus on the Family. He worked for some conservative sort of Christian right politicians, and he's got a fascinating story then before he deconstructed and kind of came away from all that. So he's actually going to be our guest in the month of March. And then I think in the month of April, I'm going to have Elgin Strait, who I've mentioned before. He's an ex-Moonie. He's an American who lives over here in the UK. He lives down in London, and he also does a podcast. I met him through another podcast that I was on a while ago, and he's an absolutely fascinating guy. And I'm going to do a podcast with him. And in fact, speaking of cults, I'm going to be doing one with Vinnie Kocius. That's coming up. She was a cult survivor. I also did another one. I had a conversation the other day with Nathaniel Manderson, or Nate Manderson, and he's a kind of a liberal Christian who writes a lot of articles on Salon. So there's some really good stuff coming down the pipeline in the next few weeks here on Mindshift Podcast. All right, let's get back into the conversation with Dr. Nick Gier as we continue to look at Doug Wilson, his most famous student. But going back to your comments about the book, it sounds to me like that article, that's straight out of Christian Reconstructionism. That goes back to guys like R.J. Rushdoony. He was arguing that you had to have a literal application of Old Testament law for civil society, and that would be a reconstructed society. And then that leads to the question, is Doug Wilson a Christian Reconstructionist? Because he's danced around that issue for years and years and years. He's been asked straight up and he's denied it, but he's some sort of a general equity theonomist. So he believes in some aspects of Christian Reconstructionism.
That is how Doug Wilson operates.
Right.
Again, there's a sort of Donald Trump parallel here, right? I mean, he is a Christian Reconstructionist.
Right.
And for many issues, he dances around in the most clever and sophistical ways.
Mm-hmm.
Had a debate, I'm sorry, my memory is fading here. He had a famous debate with a famous atheist.
Oh, Christopher Hitchens. Yeah, he had a debate with Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah, excuse me for these momentary memory lapse. Yes. And Christopher Hitchens said, I've never debated or experienced a more sophistical, that is a sophist, is what it is.
Right.
I taught them in philosophy, and their famous motto was making the weaker argument the stronger.
Mm.
And Doug Wilson is an expert at that. And I think Hitchens became a little defensive in the debate. And that's why in the last formal debate I had with him was on abortion in 1993. And he was totally intellectually dishonest after that debate.
Mm.
Because after that debate, he was a columnist in the local paper. And what he did was simply restate his argument in the debate without acknowledging that I had rebutted many of those points.
Right.
And that was a major break for me with Doug Wilson. I essentially told him, I don't have any respect for you anymore.
He lost all credibility. Well, as his former professor, surely this is the thing. Okay, one aspect of Wilson is he doesn't, with all due respect to philosophy, he doesn't have any formal academic training. He's never been to Bible college. He's never been to seminary. But on the other hand, he has an MA in philosophy, as I understand it. So therefore, he's been exposed to academic conventions. I mean, I did a PhD. I wrote a 100,000-word doctoral thesis. I know what it's like to be called up on footnotes and all that. You have to, have all the evidence and everything else. You can't plagiarize. He knows all that intellectually. So why the plagiarism? Why the sophistry? Why the dancing around the issues? The intellectual dishonesty? He knows better as an academic, if nothing else, surely.
Yeah, exactly. Right to the point. In many instances, he will make fun of his MA in philosophy, right? That it meant nothing, right?
Okay.
So one of the implications of that is that everything he did in his courses following the rules of academe are just, I'm thinking of Trump again here. They just don't count anymore because
doesn't matter.
Recruiting for Christ is the most important thing.
Mm.
And the last time that we talked, it was not a formal debate, but his on-campus ministry, the students there would have Doug Wilson speak on occasion. And I said, I'm going to go down and put a question to Wilson and see if I can get him to own his own,
try to engage with him.
Yeah, right. Because I had heard from Christ Church people that I know that he told his congregants that it is permissible to lie to preach the gospel and recruit new Christians. So I wanted to put that to Wilson. And after he had spoken, I was there, and it's on YouTube. Just look up Nick Gier and Doug Wilson, and you'll find at least two of the recordings. They are not, videos.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really proud of the way that I handled that debate, although I thought I didn't use the final point. And let me just rehearse this I said, Doug, I've heard that you say that it is okay to lie to promote the faith. And what we got into was an interesting issue. I said, let's start with Rahab in the Old Testament. Remember, she's the prostitute outside the city. Is it Jericho? No, Jericho is destroyed, but
she survived though because she lied. She lied her way to freedom.
Yeah, and she had a booth outside the city.
Yeah, she was a prostitute or sex worker.
Yeah, and she lied about something that the Israelites were trying to find out.
Yeah,
about maybe
about the spies. Yeah, that's what it was. She lied to them about. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, so that became Doug Wilson's defense. And he made that more contemporary by saying, if I were a German sheltering Jews in my house, that if the Nazis came to the door, I would lie through my teeth that I was not sheltering Jews.
Right.
Now, what I regret to say about that is that, Doug, that does not defend, okay, that is lying in, what's the right word to say? That is, it's lying simply for one particular case, right? That doesn't mean that you continue to lie or to promote lying.
Right. You're not a liar.
Policy.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I regret now that I didn't make that final point, that his policy, general policy of lying to promote the faith, is not the same as Rahab lying
to protect the spies. Yeah.
Right. So I regret, but the whole, you may want to, sometimes in debates with Doug, I didn't really do well. And I'm really proud of that. I said, Doug, I still don't respect you, but I really want to ask you this question, right? And that was the last time I engaged him.
Right. So years ago now.
2007.
But you still continue to write, obviously, and speak out about Doug Wilson. What's your concern? Because now the question comes up, is Doug Wilson just a misunderstood pastor trying to do his best and promote the gospel as he sees it? Or is he somewhere on the spectrum of a cult leader? And I've had debates with different people on this topic. What's your take on it? Why are you speaking out against what he's trying to do in Moscow?
It is, I just am obligated to speak out. Now, I don't write as much anymore because I don't want to read his, and I get people telling me about what Wilson is doing. Like I say, I can't read his blog because it just brings up one of the reasons.
Too triggering.
I used to debate evangelicals all the time. And it was just so disappointing. I mean, I got into a sort of Brer Rabbit trap, right? Right. I thought that, here's the right hand punch that's just going to knock
the haymaker.
The right hand gets stuck. At the tar baby. And then I think, I got a good left hook. And it gets stuck in the tar baby as well.
Right.
So after that, you're just emotionally drained and trapped, as it were. So I just, the last formal debate was with Doug Wilson in 1993. I mean, and especially now with my nerves frayed and, chronic pain, there's no way that I'm going to do anything like that. So the last article that I wrote for the paper, there were letters to the editor, but it was about one of the Trinity festivals that Doug held every August. The first one, the history conference where Steve Wilkins was invited, morphed into a Trinity festival, an annual Trinity festival. It no longer, I don't know when the last one happened. But Steve Wilkins was invited again. So where am I going with this? Oh, yes, I wrote an article about fraudulent Calvinists and confused Trinitarians.
Right.
It was one of my best articles on Doug Wilson. And that was the last column that I wrote, I believe. I've written some letters to the editor.
Right.
One of the last ones I did is that they were boasting that they had not had any cases of COVID. And that's why their mask-free sort of policy and protests in city squares was the right way to go. So I wrote a letter to the editor. I was in full satirical mode. And the thesis was, Calvinists have been protected. The Calvinist God has protected Christ Church from COVID. And this is not just ordinary street, denominational Calvinists. This is Doug Wilson crawling over cut glass Calvinism. Mm-hmm. I just love that. That is vintage Wilson, right? I'm a crawling, he also could say, I'm a crawling over cut glass inerrant Christian, right? Never a crack. That's a very good metaphor.
It is.
Even if there's an incipient crack, an inerrancy, we have to find usually a dishonest way of covering over the crack. Otherwise, the whole thing.
That's it, yeah. The cognitive dissonance, becomes too much, I think, because I was raised a fundamentalist Christian myself. I'm an ex-evangelical, but that was one of the things that put paid to my final, vestiges of faith, like you said, because I was raised as an inerrantist, infallibility of Scripture, and all the rest of it. I preached it, I pushed it, promoted it as a pastor for years until I couldn't sustain it anymore. When I started studying Greek and Hebrew and that, textual criticism and things like that, and it was just too much, and I couldn't sustain it. Exactly what you said earlier about it. You pin yourself into a corner from which you really can't escape. So your only options are to defend it at all costs or give it up.
Exactly.
And I gave it up. But Doug Wilson hasn't given it up. He's pushing to the hilt.
Yeah. He has the willpower. I don't want the gumption. There are words to escape me here. That is.
Yeah, the adjectives. You're running out of superlatives to describe it.
The stubbornness.
I was going to say, some have said or accused him of it's like Doug Wilson Incorporated, the whole sprawling religious. And there's other aspects we haven't even mentioned, Canon Press and his Man Rampant show and all the stuff he does on YouTube. He speaks at conferences, and obviously he's got dozens and dozens of books on Canon Press. All this stuff, it's like a giant grift because he uses nepotism and cronyism. He's got relatives and by blood and by marriage on the boards of these different entities so he can control the whole thing. I wonder how much of it is kind of a grift, like he's got to keep it going. So anybody who blows a whistle, he does shun them and excommunicate them, but he can't have anyone speaking out.
Yeah, exactly. Major fellows or friends of his there's a major Bible scholar who has a PhD in theology from Oxford. He was on the staff.
Oh,
and his name escapes me now.
Right, and a big catch though.
And a member of the Presbyterian Church of America. So he found himself in a bind, and he left New St. Andrews. And probably, if I could remember his name, I'd Google where he is. It would be a real catch.
Right.
In a place like any of the great
seminaries, Bible college, that kind of thing.
Sure, yeah. So he left. The fellow that I debated the Trinity, Doug Jones, was Doug's right-hand man. And after the debate on the Trinity, he left the church, and because there was a falling out with it. It's very hard to be close to Doug Wilson, just like it's very hard to be on Donald Trump's staff.
Yeah. Look how many he's had come and go over the years. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Only the real, diehards that don't know really what's going on stay with him.
Yeah. Or like you said, it's an interesting take, I think, when you were talking about the sort of the average pew sitter in Christ Church. They've never heard of Southern slavery as it was. They've never heard of the many, many scandals, which, we haven't even gone into those, but I cover all those in my episodes on Doug Wilson, so people can listen to those. But I'm glad you've got stuff out there because, like I said, it's an invaluable resource. I think you've got a really interesting perspective on Doug Wilson. you were his former professor. You've watched him over the decades, and you've, combated him on various levels. So I'm really glad that you've written what you've done, because I've benefited personally from it. So I really appreciate what you've done.
Well, as I told Doug when he left with his master's thesis, all I can say, Doug, is that please use this credential responsibly. And he certainly didn't. And just one note about his master's thesis. It
was on free will, wasn't it?
It was on free will. Yes. A very nice thesis.
Oh, Arminian, like an Arminian type thing?
Yes, exactly. And we had agreed that I would not be on his committee because of not conflict, but just as a matter of, intellectual principle and integrity. And he agreed. So others in my department were on them, and I read it, very well written. I mean, many times with his papers, I would hand them back to him. I said, Doug, you can do better than this. This was in my philosophy of arts course, where he wrote, and he's so clever, something about the major chord, or the one of the chords, and it was just so playful and sophistical. And I wrote right at the top, more humor than substance. Please rewrite.
Right.
And I forced him to write in a
more academic way. Yeah.
An article on Albert Camus. Right. Now that's a real challenge.
Yeah.
For a Christian. But I said, Doug, please write a straight essay here. Can you do it?
Right. Can this be done?
Yes, right. And in the philosophy of arts paper, it was just too cute. I said, Doug, you can do better than this. So he rewrote it, But that's in his character, right? That sort of thing. He's too clever by half.
Yeah, you said that before. It is true. I've found that I've read a lot of his articles on his blog and Mablog or whatever it is, and he's very clever at using wording and twisting things around. And he could say things 5-6 different ways, and when you end up finishing the article, your head is spinning a little bit because you're not really sure
exactly
what it is that he's actually saying. What is the point here? He can retract and withdraw. I mean, even on that federal vision, he says he doesn't believe in it anymore, but then he'll turn around and say, well, the content of what I believe hasn't changed. So you're going, well, what does that mean? Exactly. What does that mean?
Yeah. He's a master rhetorician.
He really is.
Yeah. So
and it's hard to pin him down.
Exactly. And I still regret not making that final point about lying for the faith. But
yeah. No, I know you always do, though. After a debate, you think, oh, I should have said that. I would have been brilliant.
Yeah. Now, we started with the question about the slavery booklet. And I have one article saying point by point, here are the fallacies.
Yeah, he refutes it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And one that simply he's not met. And that is on page 24. That is, Southern slavery was the most harmonious, multiracial society ever in history.
Yeah. In the history of the world. That's not a grandiose claim at all. Not at all.
That still stands right there in that book, unrefuted.
Yeah.
So, and the other theme you said that an underlying theme is inerrancy, because it's in the Bible. Slavery is condoned.
Yeah.
And he said the Bible says you must treat your slaves well and honorably. And neo-Confederates keep this lie that the slaves were happy campers. Right?
Happy, contented, yeah.
So if that's right, you fulfilled the requirement of the biblical imperative. Now, there's another theme, and you can see this throughout neo-Confederate thought. It was not only the Northerners' fault, the Southern world, but it was the Unitarians. This is, that's right there in the slavery booklet.
Yeah, the godless North,
The godless North.
Waging war,
led by Unitarians.
Yeah, against the godly South.
Yeah, yes, right.
Well, and I think he picks up, there's another aspect we didn't talk about, but R.L. Dabney is another aspect. They then not only plagiarized from Time on the Cross, which was itself debunked I think in the 1970s, but they just took R.L. Dabney's arguments for pro-Christian view of slavery. And I think Dabney did admit somewhere, he said, the reason that the South was judged for slavery by God was not because the slavery was evil, but because we didn't treat them according to those biblical principles. So if anything you could pull us up on, it was because we didn't do it 100% according to the Bible. And Doug Wilson will turn around and say, well, if you had slaves, if you treat them according to what the Bible says, it'd be all right. You'd be fine. So that's the kind of position he finds himself sort of trapped in, isn't it?
Sure. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know you've got stuff to do. You need to go eat your breakfast, but thank you so much, Dr. Nick Gier. How can people find you? Do you have any presence on social media at all these days? Are you kind of ramping down a little bit?
Yes. I'm on Facebook, but I don't like what's happening there.
Right.
I post my articles, my biweekly articles. I don't get any response. I think people don't want to read stuff like that. They want to had pictures of their babies,
cats,
and this sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
So I pretty much given up on Facebook.
Right.
So I can just be reached at ngier006@gmail.com. And, well, there's a firewall I write for the Idaho State Journal in Pocatello and for the Daily News in Moscow. But there are firewalls there to get into the articles.
Yeah, paywalls and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Paywalls, yeah. So my email address, I do have a website, nfgier.com. That's real easy. And most of my articles are there over the years. Some of them are not formatted properly. It's going to be they're readable.
Yeah, you can read them. Yeah.
When my webmaster did it for me, some of them didn't come in completely well formatted. But all of my stuff is there, nfgier.com.
Right. There's good resources for sure. And like I said, I know I've benefited from your stuff on Doug Wilson as well. So thank you so much for all your tireless efforts. I know you're kind of retiring now. You've slowed down a little bit. You're trying to recover a little bit from some of the health problems. So thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking with me today.
Thank you for inviting me. Enjoyed it very much.